Hello and welcome to Ethics and Moral Problems. My name is Dr. Stephen Bujno. This lecture is Ethics and Justice. We will look at contractual and fairness as two more ethical systems. When we did ethics of being, we looked at natural law and virtue ethics. When we looked at ethics of doing, we looked at utilitarianism and deontology. You'll see that these two ethical systems are a little bit of play on the ethics of doing. So there are many variations of the previous four ethical systems I shared, and there's also variations on these, but I will try to at least give you two prominent views on them so that we can understand them and contrast them. Before I talk about contractual theory proper, let me explain first how justice works in relationship between the individual and society, between society and the individual, and then between individuals themselves. If you can picture in your mind a triangle, and on the left side of the triangle is legal justice. At the top of the triangle is society or the whole. So think of an authority if it helps. So on the left-hand side of this triangle, as the line goes up, this legal justice represents all of the burdens that society, as we as individuals, offer to society as whole. So maybe an easy explanation or example would be that we pay taxes. On the right side of the triangle, coming down from society, are the representatives of society, and to all of the members, you would use or refer to that as distributive justice. So this type of justice is the benefits that come from society to all the individuals. Across the bottom of the triangle is commutative justice. This is justice between individuals themselves. So we're not looking on how to change things per se in a political way. We're looking about what particular ethics that we owe each other. So this would fall more likely into a commutative type justice. Contractual theory is based on mutuality. So there's some sort of agreement that we all come together, not formally perhaps, but at least an understanding of how one would offer something to the other. T.M. Scanlon, most known for this, the originator, we might be able to phrase this as utilitarian reasonableness. What it is premised on is this idea that we all owe something to each other. Now, that is a very basic and ancient, Platonic actually, definition of justice. Justice is what one owes to another. So this is all premised on that, but it's premised on not what society owes to us, but what we owe to each other. So this is more egalitarian in its philosophical approach. What you do here is you consider the wrongness of a particular act, and if it's not wrong, then it's at least correct, or we would say good. Now that may sound a little odd, but it doesn't start out by simply asking or saying what is good for the other person, then let's do it. It wants to make sure that what it's doing is not wrong. How you would understand that is, rather than having the rigidity of some rule that we can say all must agree to, whatever we're doing, we would say that reasonably others would not object to the action that we're performing. So it's the wrongness that determines what is right in that way. So I hope that clears it up a little bit. You're not determining a good and following it. You're starting from the premise that this does not create a wrong. Remember, if you owe somebody other, like give the other what they are due, if what you're doing is not due them, then you do not want to do that. I know that sounds a little odd. Hopefully it's not so difficult to hear, but that's what determines the right. What you want, rather than the rigidity of some deontological rule from Kant that can never ever have exceptions, like lying is always wrong, murder and harm is always wrong, here we have to form a reasonable rule. So we always know there's going to be some exceptions, but it's something that we're all going to have to, at least in theory, agree upon together. In the end, wrong acts can never be justified. So do you see this is almost as if working in the negative? We do not want to create a bad situation. And as long as we don't create a bad situation, we consider the wrongness and we understand to the best that we can of doing something that others would not object, and therefore we are doing something that is contractual and therefore good. So what governs behavior here is just these contractual moral standards that we have built up and at least tacitly agreed to. Now this reasonable rule, remember remember, I was contrasting with the deontological rule of Immanuel Kant. So rather than you could only act in a way, remember this was one of the categorical imperatives, you could only act in a way in which you can will others to act universally. This is saying one must act in a way which others would not easily object to. So you can see here a very practical application, but this will take a little bit of reason applied to it, simply because the individual is going to have to determine exactly what is this thing that I am saying will consider the wrongness and others would not object to. Now this builds on and retains the dignity of the human individual. So you can see a nod to Kant's deontology is quite evident here. As a matter of fact, I offer that as another categorical imperative, or what I simply called the human principle. And what that is that no person could be used as a means to an end. Other individuals could only be used as an end in themselves. So you can't use somebody to get what you want. Okay, so you can see it's preserving that. The method then, quite simply what they use, is right and wrongness is determining what the action is, but by what is not wrong. So you want to make sure that when you're trying to determine the right, using contractual theory here, according to Scanlon, that you consider the wrongness, and as long as what you're doing doesn't inhibit giving the other person what is their due, then you would call that a right act. And the second point, which we already mentioned, but I'm just putting them together here so you understand it, that whatever principle is being applied, or the rule, it would have to be something that others are not going to reasonably reject. So, but you understand the reasonable here-ness. This may sound like it makes it somewhat subjective. Perhaps it is to a degree, but that reasonableness is based on an individual's rationality. And remember, that rationality was what gave a person dignity, and why Immanuel Kant said in his deontology that you cannot use any person as a means to an end. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. Now, there's some criticisms on this, is that it's not really focused on the well-being of the individual per se, or of each individual, or even being a virtuous person in yourself. You're just simply looking for some universal contractual reason to do what it is that you want to do, provided that it doesn't undermine or reduce the good that's owed to someone, another person, or we should just say what is due to the other person. Also, it's a little difficult to understand that we live in a very pluralistic society, which is why these ethics are, finding their origination in trying to address all these issues. But in some cultures, it may throw us into cultural relativism, where we say, well, we here in our particular culture of the West disagree with this, but in your culture of where you live, we see that that can be a different thing, and you might determine that it is something that is not wrong and therefore right. And so the reality is that there has to be a value that generates what is owed to the other person, and there's always going to be differing values that are going to be used to generate that particular thing. So, nonetheless, it's a concern. The third criticism I'll offer is that this is for individuals. So when we say it's not aggregated across society, this is not something that you can use overall as a rule to govern regions, and a state couldn't push this forward. This is, remember, commutative justice. That's why I placed it in that type of justice. So this is the relationship between individuals, not the relationship between individuals and society, or society and individuals, but between individuals themselves. So this really boils down to what an individual owes another individual. So nonetheless, somebody could say that's not necessarily a weakness, but it is because just of that sort of lying it's outside the nature of creating a just society. This is interested in creating just actions of individuals where they consider the wrongness, and then others would not object. All right. Now, if we look at the other type of ethical theory that's being offered here today, let's return once again to our types of justice. So remember, distributive justice is the benefits that society gives to individuals. So unlike the previous slide, where I spoke about this being a justice that dealt more within commutative, this particular one will be one that delves more into distributive justice, and not what the individual owes to the other, but what does society owe to each individual. Justice as fairness is one that is going to be based on liberty. And although it may sound peculiar or perhaps just, true, but stated over simply, the foundation of this will be to determine an unbiased stance. Hopefully that'll be clear here shortly. This particular justice is John Rawls. It's a utilitarian justice, but one based on fairness, not necessarily happiness. So here it is trying to address the fairness of how goods are distributed, and because of that, this then turns in not to an egalitarian philosophy like that of contractual theory, but a political philosophy where it's the polos, where we're talking about how the public, governed by the state, may find fairness in the interactions. Now, there are two principles here, and I'll restate these in a different way when I talk about the method. But what its goals are, it tries to balance liberties, and it will do that by allowing for inequalities. So you can hear the utilitarian theme behind that. So this isn't the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, but the greatest amount of liberties for the greatest number of people. And it recognizes that in any pluralistic society, there's no way that we can achieve perfect equity. So we're going to have to allow for certain inequalities to exist. It's just not. It's not simply saying that there is no perfect way to take care of that, but it's saying that given our lack of foundational values, something is going to have to achieve, or someone will have to achieve more or have more than others. So a little more realistic. Let's put it that way. And that was probably one of his goals, even if he didn't use the word to explain it like that. So the fact that it balanced liberties, you can hear this not as that egoistic utilitarian theory where a person is has that selfishness where they're trying to do what's best for them. Here you are trying to achieve the most you can for yourself, but you're also considering the other person. So this doesn't have that same egotistical type foundation. And because there's absolutely no way that all inequalities are going to be entirely removed, that in a sense gives us the impression that this utilitarian fairness is not an idealistic political philosophy. So what he would say is that this equity, and that term gets used quite a bit in our culture today, but he would understand it as a reflective equilibrium. So what he means by that is that we all have these beliefs, and these beliefs manifest as the convictions. So I want to do this because this is what I believe. And then those convictions, they manifest as personal judgments. So if somebody were to do something, they're doing it because of conviction they have based on a belief. This understanding and this basic belief is that I want to balance liberties without being egotistical and allow for inequalities without being idealistic. So the convictions balance our personal judgments. The reality is that there are always competing things that we are trying to do. And you cannot make everybody happy, which would be this critique of the classic utilitarianism. But you can make most people happy as long as you understand that the people that you don't make happy are not going to be, in a sense, used as individuals, let's say, taken from them to give to somebody else simply so that it irons the whole thing out flat. They realize that that's not realistic. So this lack of idealism, he would say, can be understood as the difference principle. Now here, what he means by this is that when you're trying to balance liberties for all people, you're going to have to understand that the least fortunate have to be improved. So this isn't the same thing as saying all boats rise with a tide, even if that might be true per se. Nonetheless, this is trying to say that we have to make sure that the little boats can weather the storm, whatever they might be. So there's going to have to be some particular nod given directly to the least fortunate. That's just another notch where this may look for the general happiness. Well, if we were to say it's in a purely utilitarian way, where it's looking for the general happiness for the most, we would say we have to make sure that even the least fortunate are in somewhat regards more happy. But remember, this is not based on happiness, this is based on fairness. So let's say that if we're going to look for fairness across the board, we have to, at least with the difference principle, make sure that we are improving the condition and the fairness for those who are least fortunate. Part of the problem is that if this is trying to uphold the dignity of the human individual, how does that dignity find expression in equality of political rights? Because it always seems that one person's right, or some, if we might say, some advantage they might have, is going to come at a disadvantage of someone else. So that's always going to be true. That's the inequality. But while that's being done, in this justice as fairness, according to Rawls, you have to at least make certain that the least fortunate are not being unduly suppressed. So there's just something here to work out. Now, the method that he goes to use this, and I'll have to use an example so that you can understand this correctly. First, you have to establish the original position. Now, let me explain exactly what he means by that. You know, if you took a classroom of students and you said that I want everyone here to help me give a fair test, an exam. So you start asking everybody, okay, let's be as fair as we can. What type of questions should I ask? Even people who are genuinely not trying to skew it towards them, they're going to look for their own advantages. So if a person feels much more comfortable writing a short essay than they would perhaps like those multiple responses, they might say, well, look, I really think that's more fair. So it's not as though it's something bad they're choosing, but it is skewed towards them. So you'd have to ask yourself, how can I get somebody to this original position? And by that he means where they don't know their advantages and disadvantages. Now, I'm going to give you the example a little bit fuller in a second here. He says if you can get them to that original position where they don't know the advantages and disadvantages, he says then that way they will be behind a veil of ignorance. So they're ignorant of the advantages and disadvantages. So he recognizes that this is not going to create perfect justice, but he thinks this is going to be the way that we can give the greatest amount of fairness for the greatest amount of people. So let me go back to my exam question. Maybe one way, and I'm just working this out, that Rawls would say, here's a way to determine whether or not the exam questions are fair. Perhaps with the classroom, if I were in the classroom and I had 30 students in front of me, I would make up a fictional story, and I would say my wife is a high school teacher. Now, all of you went to high school, so it's likely that you know how some students cheat and how some questions are easier to cheat or to just memorize and maybe don't really assess the students' understanding, apprehension of the material as well as others. So I just say, would you guys give me 5 or 10 minutes and help me work out the best exam, which is fair for everybody, but not just going to help people that are better at, say, essay questions, or not just going to help people who are better at choosing which one of the responses solves or responds to the question being asked. So everybody starts chiming in, and they start giving me all their stuff, and I start writing down exactly what they said. So what I've done is I put them behind a veil of ignorance, because when everybody's done it and I have the exam designed, I now reveal to them that actually you guys were helping me make an exam to give to you. But see, in all fairness, even though you're nice people, if I simply said, this is what I'm doing for you, I want it to be fair, even if you tried to be fair, it's still likely that you're going to look for your own advantages and disadvantages. So I had to get you behind a veil of ignorance, an original position where you thought you basically had no horse in the race. And now you don't know the advantages and disadvantages. And you've helped me design this test, and now I'm going to give it to you. And you can't call it unfair, because it was you yourself that thought it was. So what you realize now is some of those things are not going to help you. Okay, that's good. That allows for the inequalities. But it also at least gives many people the liberty to show how they apprehend or the topic at hand. Now, that would, at least in my mind, be a good simple application, and I hope it helps in understanding the method of justice as fairness. Now, the criticism here is, well, for one, this may not make the entire room happy. In other words, if we were to use a pure utilitarian ethic, we would want the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people in the room. This may not do that. So that's one of the critiques. In the end, this might be more just according to Rawls, but we might retort, but it doesn't really bring us to the greatest number of the greatest level of happiness. The other thing is, what are these justified inequalities? In other words, you're purposely pushing a type of metric for justice out there that you know is going to decrease some people's justice. I mean, that's why this is not egotistical. You're going to allow these inequalities, and we know that going in. So does that really give another person their due? What, definition of justice is actually being used here? The one that most young people typically critique this for is its practicality. That might work in a situation in the classroom when we have a pretty closed and controlled environment there. What would you do, say, in Congress? A lot of times individuals who run for political office, they enter into Congress or Senate or such, and they might be upper class, but they're not extremely wealthy. And it seems like after they're in there 6, 8, 20, 25, 30 years, they become just, really filthy wealthy. Now, that's not saying that they're doing inside trading and everything else, but they must have the inside track on a lot of stuff that the rest of us don't have access to, because nobody else's wealth can grow that quickly. So how would you get Congress behind a veil of ignorance? They know that they're making laws they're going to be passed in a country in which they live. We can't tell them this is for another country. So some people would argue, how do you really do this? Is it even really possible? And the other part of that is, if we're going to say let's do this in society, which is what the goal here is, this requires a great degree of reflection and application of reason. And should we ask, are people really rational enough, en masse, to be able to do this? Nonetheless, a criticism. So these were just two other types of ethical stances that I think one could take. There are so many that we can play out. These particular ones, though, are a little bit of a twist on the other ethics of doing, and I thought I would share them, and I hope that these were clear to you. Have a great day.